Most people in England and many abroad have heard of the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. In fact, it's where many of us first meet and greet the Middle Ages. But what about The Fire of Love by Richard Rolle, the Hermit of Hampole? Evidence suggests that Richard Rolle was more widely read than Chaucer in the Middle Ages. Yet who today has heard of the Hermit of Hampole? If I'd come here to this sleepy little South Yorkshire village of Hampole 600 years ago, things would have been very different. The place would have been teeming with people, for this wasn't just any ordinary village. This was the site of one of the North's foremost holy places. There would have been pilgrims clutching candles, whispering prayers, and kneeling down to pray at the shrine of the man they knew as St. Richard Rolle of Hampole. If you'd like to know what drew so many people here to this sleepy little corner of South Yorkshire in the Middle Ages on pilgrimage, stick with me to find out about the life of blessed Richard Rolle, the Yorkshire saint who never was. Blessed Richard Rolle was born in the chocolate boxy village of Thornton le Dale in North Yorkshire to a small farming family. The year, around 1300, and the king at the time, Edward Longshanks, Hammer of the Scots. Richard died around 50 years later here in Hampole in 1349, probably of the Black Death, which had reached England just the year before. He never founded a famous religious order or preached rebellion of any kind, but what he did do is he changed the way that England spoke to God forever. His story begins not in Hampole, but in Oxford, at the time a city of friars, of scholars, of science, and of ceaseless arguments. When Richard went to Oxford, probably about 1315, he was still a teenager. He was sponsored by Thomas Neville, the powerful Archdeacon of Durham, who saw great promise in the young Rolle. Nevertheless, at Oxford he would have still been quite poor. While there, we are told he was more infused by religious studies, such as the Bible and theology, rather than the secular subjects. Oxford was then the beating heart of English learning, noisy, crowded, and bursting with friars of all kinds. Dominicans, Franciscans, Carmelites, Augustinians, all preaching poverty and truth, all convinced they alone had it right. The Dominicans, or Black Friars, followed Thomas Aquinas, the giant of scholastic learning. The Franciscans, the Grey Friars of St. Ebes, traced their vision to St. Francis. Their school was founded by Agnellus of Pisa and made famous by Robert Grosseteste. It was still being shaped by his pupil Roger Bacon, who mixed theology with early science. That was the Oxford that young Richard walked into, the most brilliant minds in Europe debating everything from the Trinity to the shape of the cosmos. He studied the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, then the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Beyond that learning came theology, the queen of sciences built around Peter Lombard's sentences. Every word was in Latin, every test the public disputation. To be a master was to be a performer. But Richard was a restless man. The friars around him were quarrelling about whether Christ owned his sandals. Philosophers split hairs about grace. It was dazzling. Later, he would write that he preferred the savour of devotion to the jangling of words. Oxford had taught him the form of holiness, but not its heat, and that tension between learning and love would soon drive him away from university altogether. So at 19, he did something reckless. He walked out. He went back to North Yorkshire and he argued with his father. He spoke with his sister and he took two of her robes and stitched them into a sort of rudimentary hermit's robe, and then he vanished into the woods. He quickly found shelter with the Dalton family near Richmond, kindly patrons who gave him food and a roof in exchange for prayers. There he prayed, fasted and wrote. He began to feel that mystical warmth constantly, even a musical vibration he called canna, the song that none but lovers hear. In his book, The Fire of Love, he tells us that at this time he started to practice the illuminative way. This is a stage of spiritual growth where the soul moves beyond the beginner struggles and grows in light and love of God. Passions are controlled, virtue becomes stronger, and prayer centres on the life and passion of Christ. The key virtue here is recollection, keeping the heart quietly focused on God. Temptations struck, vanity, hunger, despair, and he wrote about them all. He is the first English writer to treat the soul as a living character. After his spell in Richmond with the Daltons, we aren't quite sure where he was until he moved in near the nuns at Hampole. Some scholars have suggested the University of Paris, but after weighing the evidence, I personally don't think that is the case. When Richard Rolle lived here in Hampole, it must have been separate to the Cistercian nuns that lived here in the local nunnery, yet he probably still served them in some spiritual capacity, perhaps as an advisor. Returning to his writings, at first Richard wrote in Latin. The Fire of Love and The Mending of Life are autobiographies of the soul, but he realised that Latin locked out the people he most wished to reach, ordinary believers. So he began to translate himself. He carried the flame of his Latin words into the speech of Yorkshire. His Form of Perfect Living, written for the nun Margaret Kirkby, is a manual of holiness. How to pray, how to fast, how to love God without losing your mind. Rolle emphasises that in his work that perfect living often lies in withdrawing from the world, living in a state less occupied with material things of worldly cares and seeking out stillness so that the love of Christ may be kindled. He does not dismiss an active life altogether, but gives a strong preference and detailed guidance to the contemplative life. In Christian tradition, the active life involves outward deeds, service, ministry, and bodily labour in the world, whereas the contemplative life emphasises inner prayer, meditation, and a union with God and the sweetness of divine love. Rolle's answer is that although an active life has its place, the contemplative life is better, sweeter, more worthy and more rewarding because it leads the soul into a deep union with God in which the love of God becomes the soul's primary delight. Richard didn't mean to start a movement, but his words travelled fast. There was no printing press at the time, yet his manuscripts were copied vigorously by hand all over England. The nuns of Hampole, Yeddingham and Kirklees treasured them. Hermits and anchoresses passed them on. Researchers have found his work in dozens of medieval manuscripts. He became, quite literally, England's most copied author before printing, more widely read than Chaucer. Where Chaucer gave England wit and story, Rolle gave it heart. He became a model for a new kind of spirituality, intense, emotional, intimate. Later mystics, like Walter Hilton and Julian of Norwich, followed his lead, and through them his voice flowed straight into the bloodstream of English devotion. About 40 years after Rolle's death, another Oxford man picked up the idea, John Wycliffe. He translated the Bible into English and shook the church to its core. Did Wycliffe know about Rolle's work? We can't be sure, but the evidence is strong. The early Wycliffite preachers quote Richard. His books were copied alongside their English scriptures. Both believed that faith belongs in the heart and that the word of God can speak in English. Rolle would never have joined Wycliffe's revolt, yet his pen prepared the ground. When Cranmer later wrote his Book of Common Prayer and Tyndale printed his Bible, they used the same clear rhythm and warmth Rolle first made holy. Without intending it, the hermit of Hampole had become the grandfather of the Reformation. When he died here in 1349, the nuns buried him in their churchyard. People almost immediately came to pray. they claimed miracles and they left offerings, and by the 15th century, Hampole had become a place for local pilgrimage. Richard's writings provide us with several steps for being closer to God, even throughout our busy lives. Find a little silence in each day. God speaks, he said, in the cell of the heart. Love something good more than you love comfort. A small act of self-discipline keeps the soul awake. Read or sing a psalm. Every leaf is a letter, every sound a song. See beauty as a window, not a wall. When something moves you, a sunrise, an act of kindness, thank the giver, not just the gift. Keep warmth in your faith. It's not a hard penance that saves, he says, but burning love. And speak simply to God. Jesus prayed, so can you. After Richard's death, the nuns here petitioned Rome to make Richard a saint. They presented a list of miracles that had happened after people had prayed to Rolle or been to his shrine to the Pope. But the process stalled as the winds of reform were already blowing in England, and although he was never officially canonised, he remained what unofficially the people of Yorkshire had already decided that he was, Saint Richard Rolle of Hampole. Richard Rolle's path wasn't about fleeing the ordinary life, but rather kindling it and letting ordinary life glow with love. And though his tomb might be lost to us, his fire still burns in every English prayer said in love rather than in fear. Richard Rolle showed the world that holiness needn't be grand. It could actually be quite ordinary. It could live in a Yorkshire village, in the sound of the wind, in the warmth of a heart turned homeward. Richard Rolle made the English language a place where God could speak, and 700 years later, we are still listening